The bishop slammed his palm on the oaken table and forced the room to look up. "Speak, the bishop, or you will not stand among the blessed." The silent saint sat without moving, hands folded on the habit, eyes cast downward. Suspicion tightened the circle around the saint. Faces leaned forward, fingers on notes, a clerk waiting to mark the verdict. The tribunal's question was concrete and urgent. Had the saint spoken the name that would unravel a pact? The chapter house smelled of beeswax and damp wool. No abstract fear altered the scene, only the pressure of the question and the pause that refused to answer it. The investigative narrator stood by a column, notebook closed in one hand, watching how silence operated as a force. Suspicion drove the narrator's approach. He counted the pauses, timed the clergy's breaths, catalogued who looked away. He moved through the room like a careful instrument, not to interrupt, but to measure where omission gained value. The narrator's face tightened when a gaunt priest said, "If silence hides a crime, is it sanctity or concealment?" The prior answered, "We judge with care." The saint's silence is a vow until proven otherwise. The exchange left the tribunal in a thin, brittle balance, and the narrator decided, then and there, to follow the paper trail that had been closed with ink and seal. The chapter house hearing serves as the hook and does not wait for explanation. The bishop's demand, the physical strike upon the table, and the explicit threat of exclusion showed the stakes. From that moment the central problem was plain. The saint refused to speak, and the community had to decide whether to sanctify that refusal. The narrator introduced himself with action rather than name. He moved after the hearing to the clerk's gallery and asked for the transcript's archivist. He said, "Show me the entries on the canonization." The archivist slid a stack of brittle folios across the bench without comment. The narrator kept his tone low and steady. His decisions come from evidence, not sentiment. The first discovery came in the margins. Words had been scratched out with a blade, and a circular cipher was tucked beside a line where the saint's silence was first questioned. The narrator bent over the paper and traced the soot-stained cipher with a fingertip. This is not a clerical flourish. Someone wanted that line gone. Suspicion became a working hypothesis. Someone or some office had actively erased the record. The archivist, a thin woman named Agnes, tightened her jaw. "We seal some things for the order, Agnes. Curiosity will not help you." The narrator wrote the word redaction in his field notebook and left with Agnes's forefinger tapping the folio shut. They moved to the medieval archive room that evening. A single window let in a wedge of rain, grey light. The narrator pulled a lamp closer and read aloud the surviving lines. He kept his sentences short. The widow accused the saint of concealment. The clerk noted a sealed bead in the reliquary. The prior warned of scandal. Each plain phrase forced the archive to give a shape to the case. The narrator pressed a page that had been burned at the margin and found an imprint of a sigil. He put a finger into the ash line and flinched when the soot rubbed his skin. That physical sting made the possibility of danger concrete. Emotion shifted when the narrator met the prior in the sacristy. In the archive, suspicion had been clinical. In the sacristy, the air tightened with institutional weight, and the narrator felt the first move toward apprehension. The prior closed the sacristy door and spoke in a low voice. "You must leave that scroll alone," he said. "We protect the convent for reasons older than your questions." The narrator replied, "If silence covers a danger, it is my duty to see it named." The prior's hand landed on the reliquary lid. He did not shout. His posture implied a threat. Authority that would not hesitate. The narrator felt his pulse quicken. Apprehension rose into resolve. He would look for the hidden record regardless. The next morning, a ruined complaint from the village was produced as evidence. The narrator walked the cloister with Agnes and the prior to the place where the widow had spoken. The cloister smelled of wet stone and early light. The widow, named Maud, stood at the well with fists clenched. "The stone was cold when my son died," Maud to the prior and then to the saint. "You held back the name. You let him be sent away." The saint did not answer. "Maud, I will not see their vows used to hide a death." Her voice cracked on the last sentence. The prior took her hand lightly and said, "We must be careful, Maud. The church weighs souls and speaks with caution. Maud spat. Weighing is delaying. My son is gone. That exchange revealed the village's wound and made the canonical question a matter of life and death. After the cloister confrontation, doubt moved through the narrator in a different form. He had expected to find clerical self-preservation. He had not expected to carry the widow's accusation home with him. That shift, suspicion to personal disgust, changed how he read the records. He began cross-referencing names, matching the soldiers' muster rolls to the chapter's visitors. He found a ledger note that linked a traveling sergeant to the night the boy disappeared. The ledger entry had a notation of the saint, having visited the sergeant. The narrator said aloud in his notebook, "This is concrete. The saint visited the sergeant the night before. He did not leap to motive. He collected small facts and let them align. Every 3 pages he read, something external happened. A footstep in the corridor, a guard at the gate, a monk reminding him the library closed. Those interruptions kept him moving and prevented long interior monologues. In one such interruption, a young guard shoved a parchment into the narrator's hands before bolting away. The parchment bore the prior's seal and a rough list of names. The narrator looked up and saw the prior at the sacristy window watching him. The prior simply, "You have gone far enough." The narrator folded the parchment into his coat and did not speak. That silent decision carried the narrator into the next stage of action. The narrator found the relic chamber at night through a narrow iron key held by the relic keeper, Brother Thomas. The chamber smelled of cedar and old cloth. Brother Thomas had a quick, practical voice. "Do not touch the reliquary unless you mean to take responsibility, Brother Thomas." The narrator answered, "I mean to take responsibility for the record." Brother Thomas unfastened a small iron door and drew out a crimson-bound scroll wrapped in oilcloth and a single bead threaded and sealed in wax. The narrator's fingers brushed the wax. He felt the bead's coolness. He raised the scroll to look at the burnt sigil. The sigil was half consumed by fire, but a looped mark remained. That mark aligned with the marginal cipher in the transcripts. The narrator's chest tightened with a new emotion. Wary determination. He understood now that silence was a covenant, not a simple omission. The revelation that silence had been formalized into a covenant altered the narrator's course. The prior had insisted the records remain sealed to protect the order. The relic keeper and Agnes had acted to guard the scroll. The narrator confronted the relic keeper, "Brother Thomas, why is this sealed with fire?" Brother Thomas answered, "To bind the promise. To ensure it is not broken in anger." The narrator then asked, "Who benefited from that promise?" Brother Thomas paused. "The village survived when we kept it." The narrator felt a moral shift. The silence might have spared many, and yet the widow's son had died. The narrator's resolve reshaped into the question of which harm the community had accepted. The narrator decided the canonization ceremony would be the only open place to force a reckoning. He wrote notes and rehearsed a short presentation for the bishop. He planned to produce the scroll publicly. The lead-up scenes moved quickly. The cathedral bell, the preparation of robes, the altar candles trimmed. Each external event pushed the narrative forward. The narrator met Agnes in the nave and said, "If they will not hear me in the chapter house, I will show them the covenant in the open." Agnes looked at him and asked, "Do you know what that would do to the order?" The narrator said, "I know what it would do to the widow's son." That exchange set the course for the climax. At the canonization, the nave filled with robes and light filtered down through high windows. The bishop read a long list of virtues. The narrator stood near the pulpit with the scroll wrapped in oilcloth under his coat. He had thought of every possible interruption and prepared to speak before the assembly. When the bishop pronounced the saint to be held among the blessed, the narrator stepped forward and called, "Bishop, I must present new evidence." The guards moved like a net. The prior leaned forward. "The bishop, what evidence would you bring now?" The narrator unwrapped the oilcloth and exposed the wax, sealed bead and the scorched edge of parchment. The room's sound reduced to the scrape of chair legs. The narrator read a single line that had not been fully burned. a list of names with dates tied to the order's rationing of shelter and food. The list insinuated a ledger of choices made in winter storms. The assembly watched as the narrator produced the list and spoke the widow's son's name. In the cathedral, the tension reached the officially ordained peak. The silent saint rose, took a step to the altar, and pressed the small metal clasp over the lips with a deliberate, visible motion. The saint's hand moved with ritual precision. The saint did not speak, but the act itself spoke to the assembly. The saint chose silence in the presence of revelation. The bishop's brow folded. The guards reacted. A guard moved to seize the scroll. The narrator lunged to place the parchment on the altar and felt a hand close on his wrist. Battles of words began. The bishop demanded order. The prior insisted on protection. The narrator shouted, "This is the record of a covenant that cost a life." The prior's voice cut across. "You will endanger our people." The argument contained 6 short exchanges, rapid and clipped, with the names spoken frequently so listeners could track who was speaking. The climax ended not with a simple proclamation but with a violent seizure. A guard stepped between the narrator and the altar and wrested the scroll away. The narrator felt his wrist twist. He heard the rustle of parchment and the clang of a sword pommel. The bishop declared the act an internal matter and pronounced the saint's sanctity, while the guards carried the scroll into the secrecy. The narrator was dragged back by a steward and told, "Leave now, or be bound for contempt." He refused to yield verbally. Instead, he fixed his gaze on the saint, as the saint knelt at the altar with the metal clasp in place. That concrete image, hand, clasp, kneeling figure, resolved the chapter's public question. The institution chose to turn a mission into doctrine. After the tumult, the cathedral forecourt became a place for decisions. The bishop offered the narrator exile or silence in exchange for dropping his claims. The narrator looked at the bishop and the prior and said, "I will not swear to keep what hides harm." The bishop answered, "Then you leave without the church's protection." The narrator considered the cost and then declined both exile and forced silence. He walked away from the forecourt under the late light, shoulder heavy from the day and the knowledge that the church had converted a withheld truth into sanctity. The final scene of the chapter moved to a narrow alley behind the priory where rain fell thin and cold. The narrator waited under a lean doorway and watched Brother Thomas carry a small box. Brother Thomas's gait was careful, but he noticed the narrator's shadow. The narrator slipped forward, reached the box, and drew out the single sealed bead from where it lay in a folded cloth. He held it between thumb and forefinger and felt the wax's chill. He did not open it. He pressed the bead into his pocket instead. That action was the only fragment of the covenant he would keep outside the order's control. He felt an emotion shift from resolve to guarded sorrow. The theft of a bead, the narrator's coat slick with rain, and the knowledge that one small object would carry a question into the next investigation. Throughout the chapter, the core emotion began with suspicion, shifted to apprehension, then to resolve, then to moral conflict, and finally settled into guarded sorrow. Each shift showed itself through gestures, stopped breath, tightened jaw, folded hands, and through short-spoken lines exchanged among named characters. The chapter resolved its mini-conflict. The canonization proceeded, and the narrator lost the official record, but he secured a single physical token that promised evidence or leverage later. The narrator walked away, the bead warm against his palm, and the cathedral's bells kept time without answering whether the right choice had been made for the living. By the end, listeners can recall the names and roles: the silent saint who refused speech and sealed the lips, the investigative narrator who pursued the redacted record, the bishop who demanded order, the prior who defended the order, Agnes the archivist who guarded files, Brother Thomas the relic keeper who revealed the scroll, and Maud the widow who accused the saint of withholding a name. Each appeared repeatedly and each choice changed the direction of events. The chapter ended on an action, not a reflection. The narrator placed the bead in his pocket and stepped into the rain, carrying a single fragment of a covenant that the church had turned into sanctity. A herald's call split the nave. Reveal the truth now, or the record will mark your refusal." Suspicion tightened the assembly like a tightened rope. The silent saint remained seated, hands folded, lips closed under the metal clasp. Dozens of eyes moved from the clasp to the saint's downward gaze. Within those first beats, the central problem declared itself plainly. The community demanded disclosure, and the saint refused. That refusal threatened reputation, office, and safety. It forced a civic choice into a spiritual right. The investigative narrator stood near the clerk's bench and wrote as much with a stub of lead. He had read the earlier account. The bishop had slammed his palm on the oaken table and demanded speech. He noted that gesture now on his margin, and he felt suspicion steering his work. Suspicion moved his questions. He would test documents, measure testimony, and watch gestures for the truth that silence tried to conceal. He closed his notebook and followed the action instead of supplying a tidy answer. The herald stepped forward again. "Bishop, the assembly demands clarity. The saint will speak or we will not proceed." His voice contained the civic authority of the office. Clerk Thomas, seated 2 benches down, shifted his parchment and met the herald's eye. "Record, please." The clerk, "Every refusal will be noted." Thomas's fingers tightened around his quill and then released it. The saint's hands did not move. A woman near the easel whispered the saint's name, Sister Miriam. Someone corrected. But the name belonged to a helper, not the saint. The crowd's murmurs increased. The bishop rose, cloak dragging the stone. He showed his face and said, "Silence can be sanctified only when it serves the flock." His sentence landed like an instruction and changed the mood in the nave. Inquisitor Hadran's jaw hardened. Hadran stood at the edge of the nave and called, "This is not sanctity, this is concealment. Reveal the scroll or admit deceit." He stepped forward, and his boots set a sharp rhythm against the flagstones. He used the language of law rather than the language of mercy and expected a confession. The saint did not answer. The assembly recoiled at Hadran's demand and leaned toward the drama. Outside in the cloister corridor, the bishop and Hadran argued in a narrow space where light fell in bars through the windows. "We do not force holy silence." The bishop, "We test its sanctity." Hadran struck a palm against the stone and answered, "And if the silence hides sedition, bishop? If it shields heresy against the flock?" The clerk, who had been present for the earlier outburst at the oaken table, said, "A scandal will tear us apart. We record, I warn you." His voice carried the clerk's constant fear for the order's reputation. They exchanged 3 quick lines then. "We weigh souls." The bishop, "We do not coerce truth." Hadran replied, "Coercion protects no one." The clerk. The exchange was curt, each line clipped, and the tension rose through the corridor. Physical gestures accompanied each claim, the bishop's hand smoothing his robe, Hadran's fingers curling into a fist, the clerk's shoulders hunching against the cold stone. The corridor argument forced the political stakes into daylight. It was not an abstract debate, but a tactical move about authority and consequence. Sister Miriam moved through the shadowed corridors with purpose. She unlatched the silent saint's satchel in a hidden vestry and drew out the thread, wrapped rosary and the sealed scroll. The rosary's single-sealed bead flashed dull silver in her palm. She laid both items on the wooden table and spoke quietly to 2 members of the small council. "If the scroll comes forward, those named will be hunted. If it stays sealed, we preserve lives." Her voice did not waver. The small council pressed faces close, debated in quick, low sentences, and argued over the single choice. "Exposure or protection? We cannot bury evidence." One council member said. "We cannot risk others' lives either." Sister Miriam replied, "Who will take responsibility? Who will bear the blame?" The saint's name was spoken only in fragments during that meeting. The saint sat in the vestry doorway, watching, lips sealed. When the council asked the saint a direct question, the saint's eyes flicked up, then away. The saint's absence of speech functioned as answer. The investigative narrator sought archivist Thomas in the monastic archive that afternoon. Shelves rose like dark cliffs between ladders and brittle folios. Thomas brushed ash from a folio and handed it over. "This edge was burned." "Thomas, look at the marginalia." Someone tried to erase a name. The narrator bent close. He saw a partial sigil inked in the margin and the charred curling of the parchment. He touched the page with a gloved finger and smelled ash and iron. The discovery reframed the secret. The scroll did not read like a private confession. It bore signs of a covenant that had been deliberately obscured. They read aloud key phrases and compared them. Here, Thomas, pointing with a lamp's cone, a clause binds those who shelter the persecuted. It names a price for disclosure. The narrator's pen scraped across his notebook. Does it name the bishop? Thomas looked away and told him, the handwriting matches a hand in these records, a clerk's hand, long since returned to service. The revelation made the bishop's previous outburst take on a new cast. The bishop was implicated not as distant authority but as a participant. Word spread quickly. Sister Miriam, having returned the rosary and the sealed scroll to the saint's satchel, met Inquisitor Hadrian beneath the cloister's stone arches. She cradled the rosary in both hands and said, I will stand as guarantor. Take me before the council if you must. Hadrian's voice hardened. Will you swear, Miriam? I will, she answered. Her jaw set. Hadrian pressed on. Swear on Christ's body. Swear in front of the assembly. Miriam inhaled steadily and answered, I swear I will neither speak the names nor hand the scroll to you. The exchange lasted only a few lines, but it shifted the moral pressure onto Miriam and away from the saint. Hadrian's reaction sharpened into anger. You will not be the shield of secrecy when the truth could save others. Miriam's reply was a single, steady sentence. You do not choose who is spared. We do. The clash became physical when Hadrian reached for the rosary. Miriam clutched it to her chest. Hadrian's fingers brushed her sleeve and then withdrew. The encounter ended by force of restraint and produced a fresh escalation, a direct confrontation over the physical object that symbolized protection. Back in the bishop's private study at dusk, the investigative narrator placed the burned folio and his notes on the table. He allowed, This is not a private sin. It is a binding covenant. The bishop's eyes narrowed. You mean they sheltered heretics? He asked. The narrator did not soften his language. They sheltered a persecuted group. The scroll names those compacts and the cost of betrayal. The bishop looked away and touched his ring. If I sanctioned a covenant, the bishop slowly. I did so to keep people alive. His sentence admitted involvement without naming specific acts. The narrator recorded the admission. He watched the bishop's fingers tremble as he replaced his spectacles. Hadrian, present in the doorway, took in the papers and said, Then the file is not merely a relic but a legal instrument. If you validated it, bishop, you are tied to the consequences. The bishop met Hadrian's gaze for 3 measured breaths, and the balance of authority shifted. The plot moved from accusation to implication. That evening the assembly reconvened for the preliminary rite. The nave smelled of wax and dust. Hadrian prepared to force the saint into speech by naming consequences. Exposure of names, public condemnation, and legal actions that would follow. He stepped forward and declared, If you will not reveal, I will produce the record and force disclosure by jurisdiction. The crowd reacted with murmurs like waves. Some shouted agreement, others cried for mercy. The saint remained motionless. The bishop raised a hand and interrupted the proceedings. Stop, the bishop. His voice calmed the room. He walked to the saint and stood before the assembly. We have tested the saint's silence and interrogated its source. I will say this plainly. This silence shall be sanctified today. The sentence landed with force and silenced Hadrian's march. People gasped and some rose from their benches. Bishop, Hadrian snapped, You cannot declare sanctity over what may be a conspiracy. I can, the bishop replied. The community chooses to consecrate this silence because its revelation will destroy more than it saves. The bishop's pronouncement turned an attempted revelation into an act of consecration. Outrage and awe fought in the crowd. A merchant shouted, Hypocrisy! A widow whispered, Blessed be the one who spares the living. The clerk bent and made a precise notation. Sister Miriam moved to the saint and slipped the sealed scroll into a private reliquary beneath her cloak. Her hands trembled enough for the clerk to see and note, but she did not release the reliquary. The act converted the public drama into a guarded ritual. A short, sharp surprise followed. A voice from the choir loft called a name associated with the covenant, and a man in the assembly flinched visibly and then left. This was the mid-chapter cliffhanger, a sudden external action that made the threat tangible. People watched the man go and wondered if the bishop's decision would indeed hold, or if someone would pursue the covenant outside the church's protection. The moment split the assembly's attention and planted a seed of immediate danger. After the rite ended, the crowd dispersed with slow steps. Sister Miriam escorted the saint down a side aisle and into the cloister garden. She opened the reliquary and placed the sealed scroll on a charred stone plinth. The saint knelt, head bowed, lips still clasped. "Miriam only, I keep this with my life." The saint's breath made small, even movements. Her hands rested against the rosary. The physicality of the gesture showed resolve rather than explanation. The clerk recorded the day's decision with exact language. Sanctified silence, protected relic, guarantor named as Sister Miriam. He sealed the page with wax and a small cipher. He left a note in the margin. Record to be kept in archive, access limited to bishop, inquisitor, and archivist. His action codified the new ritual of silence. The narrator copied the notation and looked at the bishop, who did not meet his eye. That night, in the archive by candlelight, the investigative narrator placed the reliquary on a table and shut the iron lid with a soft click. He set his field notebook beside it and wrote a single line about cost: names preserved, lives protected, authority compromised. He recorded the marginal burn, the partial sigil, and the clerk's handwriting. He catalogued events with evidence, not speculation. The saint slept under the chapel's hush, still breathing, lips sealed. The chapter closed with a concrete act. The narrator sealed the reliquary and locked the archive. Emotion shifts threaded the chapter. Suspicion that drove the investigation gave way to anger during confrontations, then moved toward reluctant respect when the bishop consecrated silence. Fear flared when a man fled the assembly, and it settled into measured protection when the reliquary was locked. All shifts showed in gestures: the bishop's palm, Hadran's clenched jaw, Sister Miriam's trembling hands, the clerk's precise notation, not as abstract statements but as tangible reactions. The chapter resolved its immediate conflict. The assembly's demand for disclosure met the bishop's decision to sanctify silence, and the scroll was placed under guarded custody. The narrator left a final, concrete note in the archive's ledger: reliquary secured, access limited, witnesses. Bishop, inquisitor, archivist, Sister Miriam, clerk. He closed the ledger and pushed a weight across the desk. As he extinguished his candle, the weight of the choice remained visible in the wax-dripped floor and in the single sealed bead on the rosary. The last line of the chapter is a precise action. The archive door clicked and locked behind him. The chapter ends not on a vague promise, but on an anchored event. The doors clicked, the reliquary's seal, and the narrator's notation. Those physical facts preserved the moment and left the larger story ready to continue, with the covenant intact and its consequences recorded. The scribe shoved the sealed scroll onto the altar and spoke the demand aloud. "Unbind it now." Suspicion tightened the circle immediately. Several elders tensed, fingers finding notes and rosaries. The silent saint sat with hands folded, the metal clasp visible at the lips, and did not move. That suspicion, who else could hold what the scroll contained, and why refuse to speak, drove every hand in the reliquary toward the same question. What must be kept, and at what cost? The cathedral's stone swallowed the scribe's breath. Outside the sacrarium, the earlier outrage was still raw. The bishop had struck the eucharist table in the chapter house 2 nights before and demanded speech. A herald had split the nave with a warning that the record would note refusal. Those incidents had already shaped the assembly's patience. Now, in the low chamber beneath the nave, the problem was immediate and concrete. An unopened document, a metal clasp over a mouth, a council waiting for a single utterance that would change vows, privileges, and lives. The investigative narrator watched from the leaning table, fingers curled around a damaged ledger. He had catalogued marginalia for years and recognized uncertainty when it moved through a room. He stepped forward and set the ledger down so all could see the faded note at the page margin. "Read this," he said, and opened to a cramped script. The presence of suspicion in the room altered how the bishop would act. It made threats sharper and mercy shrilly uncertain. The narrator's voice was calm, measured, and intended to reorder the council's assumptions. Scribe pressed both palms to the south face of the altar, then balled his fingers into a fist. "Bishop," he said, "we brought witness. We brought a sealed testimony. If the saint will not speak, let the seal be opened in the record." He did not meet the saint's eyes. The bishop answered with a clipped motion. "Scribe, place the scroll. Speak its title." The bishop's hand rested on his chest as if to steady breath. His mouth worked around syllables of procedure. An inquisitorial deputy stepped closer and fanned a sheet of parchment that smelled faintly of wax. "If the record shows refusal," the deputy said, "privileges are suspended. Monastic lands stand at risk. We cannot shelter scandal." He looked directly at the bishop, then at the saint. "Bishop, do you intend to preserve this house, or let rumor carry it off?" Sister Agnes moved between them with deliberate steps and set her palm on the scribe's arm. "Bishop," she said, "this is a living creature before you." And a vow held inside metal, her voice carried neither pleading melody nor frayed entreaty. She pressed for practicality. "If we break more than bone tonight, we lose both truth and a place to keep it." She glanced at the saint's lips and then at the metal clasp. The saint did not look up. His hands remained folded. He breathed slowly. The clasp caught candlelight and threw a line across his lower face. The council's suspicion shifted fractionally into a different pressure, curiosity edged with either pity or contempt, depending on the elder. The investigative narrator tapped the ledger's edge and read aloud the marginalia he had found. "Bound under covenant, not testimony. See Rubrica 4, the page smelled of damp ink and time. Conversation fractured into short bursts. Covenant. The bishop, what covenant?" The ledger names a local confraternity oath. The narrator, it links the scroll to a compact between lay patrons and monastic houses. "It is not ordinary testimony. Then the matter is political," the inquisitorial deputy said. "Then we must unbind it for the record." His tone tightened. The Reverend Inquisitor folded his hands. "If this is a compact, and the compact is binding, the community's privileges may be at stake. The king may revoke charters." His eyes slid toward the reliquary entrance as if expecting a herald. An external sound answered. Footsteps in the vault above, a herald's cuirass clinking against stone. The herald descended, cloak still damp from the outer cold, and handed a sealed writ to the bishop. By royal hand, the herald, "This house must answer if scandal spreads. Keep your rights, or we remove them." He bowed and retreated without waiting for a reply. The scroll on the altar suddenly sat between legal peril and ecclesiastical threat. Sister Agnes's fingers tightened on the scribe's sleeve. Her posture changed. She moved as if to kneel but held. "Bishop," she said, "we can contain this. Sanctify the one who resists, rather than yield the whole house to politics." Her voice was low. "If this is bound by covenant, canonization can reframe the object as relic, not litigation." She looked at the saint, then at the elders. "Let me oversee the binding." That suggestion split the council into whispered lines. "Sister Agnes suggests canonization to prevent political fallout," murmured one elder. "Sanctify, bind, perform rites, convert a liability into a relic." The idea moved quickly because it proposed an action that shifted the problem from public procedure to ritual containment. It was a tactical choice, and that changed the assembly's mood. Suspicion bent toward calculation. The scribe, hands trembling, spoke twice in quick succession. "Open it. If the saint will not, if he will not speak, let the seal break before witnesses. The record must be plain." He pressed with his palm. His voice went small. "If you will not accept the saint's choice, then let us at least see what is written." His insistence forced the room's tempo into a new key. A small twist revealed itself when the investigative narrator turned another page of the ledger and showed the marginal note in full. A terse line in a different hand, "Bind not to be read. The covenant holds danger if spoken openly." The room shifted in a manner different from anger. A palpable recoil spread through the elders' faces. The narrator had intended to clarify procedure. Instead, he introduced danger into the public calculus. "Danger." The bishop's voice thinned. "What danger?" The narrator tapped the ink. "The note implies the scroll functions as containment. It is written not for witnesses, but to hold something away from speech. That changes whether we treat it as testimony or as a sealed instrument of protection. He closed the ledger slowly. Scribe's hand shook more visibly. I did not know. He said, I was told it was a confession. I brought it as proof. You did what you were asked. Sister Agnes replied, not looking at him. We will not put blame on a man who carried a sealed thing. A council elder leaned forward. If the thing inside is dangerous when read, then unbinding it risks us all, he said. If it protects, then the saint's refusal may be the safest course. Emotion shifted again in the room. Suspicion gave way to a careful dread. Hands withdrew from the altar, not from fear of punishment, but from the sense that opening the seal could create a new physical harm. The bishop rubbed his forehead and barked a short order. Bring the clasp. We will decide in council whether we unbind or sanctify. They argued in quiet, rapid lines. Unbind and record, the inquisitor said. Either we know and can act, or we are blind and at risk. Sanctify and bind, countered Sister Agnes. If this is a covenant instrument, sanctity will place it beyond politics. If sanctified, the crown might still seize it, the herald added. Crown law binds relics as well under certain writs. The scribe began to unfold his sleeves as if expecting to do the work. The bishop signaled to 2 attendants to bring iron tools. As hands reached for metal, the silent saint shifted once, a tiny contraction across his jaw where the scar lay. It was the only visible movement he made. He did not look at anyone. He breathed, slow and even. The assemblage noticed the saint's silence not as absence but as active resistance. He held his vow. When the bishop ordered the clasp removed, Sister Agnes stepped forward, voice low and sharp. Bishop, wait. She put both palms on the altar. You will open what we cannot close easily. Let me bind it first in a ritual manner, so if the seal breaks, we have countermeasures. Her plea created a new field of negotiation. A council elder sniffed and countered. Sister Agnes, we are not a monastery of women alone. We must act according to law. They argued in quick exchanges for 3 minutes, short sentences, each name repeated often so listeners could track the speakers. Bishop, the writ, the herald, bishop, privileges, scribe, the seal, Sister Agnes, your plan. The force of the argument lay in the action. Hands reaching, tools clinking, candle smoke shifting as figures leaned. No paragraph lingered on inner murmurs. Events arrived regularly. A herald's entrance, a marginal note, a new threat, a plea for mercy. Then the bishop nodded and ordered the clasp forced. 2 clerics took the iron. They worked with practiced hands at the thin metal, pushing through rust. The scribe pressed his thumb to the parchment to steady it. The saint's legs tightened against the stool leg. His jaw clenched. Sister Agnes moved to intercept, and then stopped when the bishop raised his hand. The clasp resisted. Iron groaned. A small snap sounded, then a crack. The scribe gave a sharp exhalation. For an instant, nothing happened. The room held, waiting for the sound of speech, for inked words, for confession. Then the parchment darkened at the fold and a faint sign, thin, like smoke shaped into a symbol, bloomed across the page. A pressure moved through the chamber that their bodies felt as a cut of cool across the skin. Several elders staggered, leaning against pillars to steady themselves. The saint sagged and nearly slipped off his stool. Sister Agnes caught his arm and steadied him, fingers bracing the saint's wrist. The bishop's eyes widened. What is that? He demanded. The scribe whispered, It reads nothing I know. It is a sigil, a shape, and I feel cold where it rests. He scanned the ink and then shook his head. I cannot say words from this hand. His breath came shallow. Panic rose, but it was practical panic. People reached for objects that might help. Candles, water, blessed salt, bring water. The inquisitor ordered, ring bells. Invoke warding. The council elders did exactly that, moving with procedural improvisation. The sound of leather, the whisper of cloth, the clack of beads. The room's tempo sped into emergency. Sister Agnes pressed her palm over the parchment, though she had no claim to its words. Nothing. She moved in action. She wrapped a strip of linen around the scroll and tied it with crimson thread. Her hands worked quickly, fingers knotting with steady pressure while the saint's shoulders trembled against her hold. Hold it, she said to those nearest. Keep it still. Do not let anyone read. Her words contained an order and a care. The investigative narrator recorded the sigil into his ledger, copying the shape with a practiced hand. He noted the ink's reaction as it darkened on the page and left a faint scent of iron on his fingertips. He did not attempt to read aloud. Instead, he closed his notebook and said, "This is not mere testimony. The covenant named in margin binds speech for a reason beyond politics. If we publish this text, the harm could extend beyond our house." His voice carried the specific observation and the practical implication. A quiet resolution followed a short conversation. No one in the room wanted to be the party to mistake. The herald still held the writ but lowered his head. "If sanctity prevents court seizure, I recommend sanctification for containment," he said. His language was legal, not liturgical, but it steered the council's calculus toward ritual solution. The bishop, after a long pause, agreed, "We will not unbind further. We will accept sanctity as containment while Sister Agnes oversees the binding. We will enter the scroll into reliquary rites, and record a sealed duplicate for archive under my watch." He made the motion with a steady hand. Names in the room repeated and confirmed. Bishop, Sister Agnes, the scribe, the herald, the inquisitor. Each name accompanied a short action. Sister Agnes moved at once. "I will oversee the binding," she said. "I volunteer. I will lay the ritual and keep the cord." She looked at the saint. "I will not let this become a weapon." The saint let his head tilt once. A minimal tilt towards Sister Agnes rather than any spoken acknowledgement. That gesture carried more weight than a line of speech. It shifted the room's emotion once more, from dread toward guarded relief fused with an unresolved unease. The council had chosen containment, but containment was an active measure, not closure. The council set a plan in motion. The saint would be canonized in rite before the morning chapel. The scroll would be wrapped in ritual cloth, bound in crimson, placed inside a reliquary chest, and sealed with relic inscriptions. Sister Agnes and 2 entrusted elders would perform and witness the sealing. The investigative narrator would produce a constrained copy of the ledger to be bound and stored in the archive under oath. The herald's writ would remain lodged in the bishop's, keeping as a reminder that politics still watched. In the private moment after the public decision, the bishop leaned over the altar and spoke more quietly than he had earlier. Why will he not speak? He asked Sister Agnes, "Is this stubbornness or sanctity?" Sister Agnes returned the bishop's look with a small, steady reply. "I believe he protects something that does not belong to him alone. He accepted silence rather than let a danger loose. That is not stubbornness. It is custody." She paused and added, "It will be our duty now to turn that custody into protection." Her language made the bishop accountable for the choice they had made. Outside the reliquary, dawn moved in pale through the narrow window slits. They worked in the cold seams between night and chapel morning. Sister Agnes wrapped leaded plates into linen and pressed invocations from memory into a careful litany. She chanted short lines and named saints who stood for guardianship. Her voice did not plead, it instructed. The saint knelt when the bishop approached with chrism and oil. The bishop laid hands on the saint's shoulder in a practiced motion and intoned the minimal words of sanctification. At the moment the bishop sealed the reliquary, the investigative narrator copied a constrained record into a fresh volume. He sealed it with wax and a cipher of his own, a mark that indicated the ledger had been duplicated under oath for safe keeping. He placed the duplicate inside a chest bound to remain accessible only to the chapter and to Sister Agnes. He wrote the marginal note in full, bound not to be read. Held as containment, the narrator did not celebrate. He recorded details with a historian's eye. The exact weight of the crimson thread, the temperature change when the sigil bloomed, the smell of iron. He noted how Sister Agnes' hand shook once when she tied the final knot. He observed the saint as he accepted the ring of cord. The saint did not speak, but he allowed Sister Agnes to slip a single sealed bead from his rosary into the binding. The gesture told the council more than an oath could. A secondary twist came when the narrator later compared the constrained duplicate to the original. There was a line in the original's margin that had been missed amid earlier notes. The name of a lay patron, a woman of standing whose family maintained a private compact with the monastery. The presence of that name explained why the crown watched and why politics might seize the relic. The narrator logged the name and the dates. He marked the entry for discreet correspondence. Sister Agnes volunteered to be the relic's steward. She petitioned the bishop to give her custody and to create a simple rule for oversight. Twice yearly public rites to reaffirm the relic's sanctity, but no reading of the text. The bishop accepted on the condition that the investigative narrator keep a sealed duplicate and that 2 elders would witness every renewal. The herald, present as legal officer, agreed to the arrangement in a curt nod. Their signatures, Sister Agnes, bishop, 2 elders, marked the recorded resolution. In the archive, late after the ceremonies, the investigative narrator sat alone and copied a second constrained entry. He worked with deliberate precision. The pen scratched, the wick glowed, the dew of parchment exhaled. He sealed the duplicate with a small silver clasp engraved with a mouth closed in relief. He placed the duplicate beside the reliquary chest, then wrote one line in the margin that he alone understood. Containment preserved under chapter oath. He reflected not in long monologue but in decision. He would keep watch. He had altered the story from public record to guarded custody. The canonization had changed the legal status. It had not erased the danger suggested by marginalia and sigil. He accepted the responsibility of the ledger as if it were a new relic to be protected by his writing. The final concrete act occurred when Sister Agnes fastened the chastened chest's lock and handed the key to the bishop while whispering the list of watchers. The bishop took the key and slid it into the pocket of his habit. He did not speak of thanks. He set the writ into a drawer and then, together with Sister Agnes and the narrator, they left the underground chamber. The saint remained seated on the stool, hands folded, lips still beneath their metal clasp. He rose slowly when the ritual demanded it and allowed the bishop to place a simple circuit at his brow. The chapter closed on a small, resolute motion. The investigative narrator sealed the ledger duplicate and placed it beside the reliquary. Sister Agnes tightened the crimson thread one last time and tied the small silver clasp shut. The bishop closed the reliquary and locked the chest. Outside, the early light found the cathedral sworn stones. Inside, the community had traded an explosive exposure for a guarded sanctity. The room's suspicion had become calculation, dread, and finally guarded stewardship. They had resolved immediate danger without reading the scroll aloud. The canonization functioned as containment, and the saint accepted the arrangement without a single word. The herald departed with his writ still in hand, the scribe collected his tools, and the elders returned to their duties carrying something new, a secret wrapped in ritual and law. The investigative narrator left a final, concrete note. He filed a copy, sealed it under oath, and placed it beside the reliquary chest. He closed the ledger and, with a single motion, locked the archive door behind him.